All right, so we're going to be continuing our discussion on motivation, and this time we're going to be talking about what is our motivation for sexual behavior. Now, as we know, s- sex has helped our species to procreate and to stay alive, right? Without reproduction, our species would not be here. All right. So there is an evolutionary adaptation to why sex occurs, right? But sex is not just limited for the purposes of reproduction. There are many other motivations for why we engage in sex. But first, let's talk about some biological components of the motivation for sexual behavior. Okay. Right. So some of the biological mechanisms that regulate sexual behavior and motivation are the medial preoptic area, which is an area of the hypothalamus that is involved in the ability to engage in sexual behavior, but it does not affect sexual motivation. So what it means is that this area is involved in the ability to physically be able to engage in sex, okay? So it is responsible for us being able to get aroused, for a person to get erected, for example, but and it does not affect the sexual motivation. So it has nothing to do with motivating you for wanting to have sex. It just is just responsible for the physical response of arousal, okay? The amygdala and the nucleus accumbens are involved in motivation for sexual behavior, but they do not affect the ability to engage in it. So it is responsible more so, these two areas are responsible more so for the motivation, okay? For wanting to engage in sex, meaning a person wants to have sex, so they will be motivated and go out and seek it. So these areas are probably responsible for that. Whether the person can, let's say, perform, these areas do not have to do with that. So as you can see, these areas of the brain together are responsible for the overall sexual experience, okay? So again, damage, for example, to the amygdala and the nucleus accumbens, right, might result in a decrease for motivation for engaging in sex, okay? Um, so a person who may have damage in these areas of the brain may never want to have sex, for example, right? They are just not motivated to seek out sex, right? And that doesn't mean that they're not able to physically, it just means they're not motivated. But if a person has damage to the medial preoptic area and the hypothalamus, for example, they may not be able to physically get aroused, right? They may still want to have sex, but their motivation has, I mean, sorry, but their ability to engage is not possible. Okay, so they have the motivation, but they may not be able to have the physiological response, which is why, we have pills for that nowadays, right? Like Viagra, okay? So again, the hypothalamus is responsible, I mentioned earlier in another video, that is responsible in endocrine function, so hormones, right? It is responsible for regulating hormones. So for, let's say, sexual motivation for men and women, then may be affected by the levels of hormones, specifically testosterone that a person has. So if a person has, I know we tend to believe that only men have testosterone, but no, women also have testosterone, just like men have, again, estrogen, right? But again, there are different levels from person to person, right? But you know, there has been research shown that the motivation for men and women to engage in sexual behavior sometimes has to do with the circulating levels of testosterone of the person. Okay, so that is one of the motivations for why a person may want to engage in sex. Okay, but again, we're talking about some of the physiological components of why a person may want to engage in sex and also their ability to perform in sex, right? Um, but let's go back and look at some overarching studies that have looked into sexual behavior, okay? So a famous researcher, Alfred Kinsley, right, was, a very famous and infamous person, right, during his time, because he conducted a large study in the 1940s, right, a large scale study that demonstrated the incredible diversity of human sexuality. So in the 1940s, okay, in the 1940s, research and just overall knowledge of sex was very limited, okay? Especially empirically based information, meaning scientifically based information. What most people knew about sex was told to them by their physicians, because a lot of people didn't talk about it. It was very taboo, right? So a lot of times people learned about sex through talking with others, right, or talking to their physicians, but it wasn't something very science based. So I know that they didn't have access to, like, let's say, sex ed classes or the internet, right? So they can look up information about sex or how sex worked, right? So Alfred Kinsey believed, hey, we need to do more to understand sex, and we need to have a conversation, a social conversation about human sexuality. So he conducted this large scale study. And again, American sexual behavior at the time was very private, okay? And because it was very, very private, when he conducted this large scale study, a lot of people wanted to know more about it. So there was a lot of massive interest in his reports and in his books, right? About male and female sexual behavior, right? Um, because at the time, a lot of people believed women did not like sex. A lot of people believed that women would only have sex for reproductive purposes. A lot of people thought that only men were motivated to have sex, right? Um, so a lot of people really wanted to know about male and female sexual behavior. But again, not everybody was happy. Some countries banned his books because, a lot of taboo, right? Um, but essentially what he found in his research were that women were just as interested as men, and just as experienced in sex. So women and men were similarly interested in sex and had similar experiences, okay? Also, women and men were both masturbated for pleasure. So it wasn't just about, penetrative sex. Men and women were, sexually motivated in other forms as well, such as masturbation. And also that homosexual acts were very common, okay? Even though it was very taboo and nobody talked about it, it was actually very common even in the 1940s, okay? And so that's why he developed a scale to categorize individuals, an individual based on their sexual orientation, okay? So he developed what we know as the Kinsey scale, that is still commonly used today to categorize an individual's sexual orientation, okay? Now, Virginia Johnson and William Masters, they were also big pioneers in terms of human sexuality research, okay? Um, they observed individuals engaging in sexual behavior. So if we go back to the past two slides, where I was talking about, the physiological processes that occur for a person wanting to be motivated in sex, right? And also like the just observational, I've gotten a lot of questions of like from students asking, well, how do they know people, how sex works for people? How do they know about uh, this research? Like, how do people find out these things? Do they just like watch people or something? Well, yes, like I just said, Virginia Johnson and William Masters actually observed individuals engaging in sexual behavior to sort of learn a lot about what motivates people to have sex and how sex works, and just a lot of knowledge about human sexuality. So they observed over 700 people having sex in a variety of positions, including masturbation, or whether it was masturbation manually or with a device. So they observed a lot of people in sexual behaviors, okay? And what they did is during their observations, they recorded measurements of, a lot of physiological variables, things like blood pressure, respiration rate, right? They also recorded measurements of sexual arousal, so things like vaginal lubrication, penile tumescence, right? Which is again related to an erection, right? So in total, Virginia Johnson and William Masters observed over 10,000 sexual acts as part of their research. And that is a lot of the research that we know now about sex. And so um, they divided all these, they came up with all this research, and they found a lot of similarities between men and women, okay? And so what they found was this sexual response cycle. That is something that they came up with to sort of explain that men and women have very similar sexual experiences. And so they divided the sexual response cycle into 4 phases, again, that are fairly similar in men and women. These 4 phases are the excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution phases, okay? So again, these are the 4 phases of the sexual response cycle. So there's obviously excitement, which has to do with arousal of the penis or the clitoris, right? And during this stage, there's a lubrication of the vaginal canal, right? Now, during the excitement stage, obviously people will engage in sexual activity, right? And then a person will reach plateau. During the plateau stage, women experience swelling of the vagina and increased blood flow to the labia minora. Men experience full erection and often exhibit pre-ejaculatory fluids, right? Um, then that then after that, that leads to orgasm, right? Which um, can be multiple for women, right? And in women, there's rhythmic contractions of the pelvis and the uterus, along with muscle tension, right? In men, how an orgasm feels, it has to do with pelvic contractions as well, just like women, right? Um, and it is accompanied by a buildup of seminal fluid, right, near the urethra that is, forced out by contraction of the genital muscles. So ejaculation, okay? And finally, the resolution stage, okay? So the resolution is a relatively rapid return to an unaroused state by a decrease in blood pressure and muscular relaxation, okay? So now this sexual response cycle can obviously be repeated, right? However, men have a longer refractory period than women do, okay? And it does vary from person to person, okay? But this is essentially what Virginia and Virginia Masters and Virginia Johnson, sorry, and William Masters came up with, which was the sexual response cycle. From all their observations, they found that men and women have actually a very similar process or trajectory during their sexual encounter, okay? Sexual orientation is the emotional and erotic attraction to same-sex individuals, opposite-sex individuals, or both, okay? So somewhere between 3 to 10% of the population identifies as homosexual. As we said, Alfred Kinsey and Virginia Masters found very similar things that, again, a good percentage of the population does identify as sexual orientation, regardless of the era of time that they conducted their research, right? There is a pretty high number of people who identify as non-heterosexual, okay? And people often believe that what causes homosexuality is due to like socialization, right? How a person is raised, or maybe even socialization in terms of society, but also family experiences, right? So research shows that there are very similar backgrounds and family experiences between heterosexual and homosexual individuals. So then so a lot of people believed again that, or still believe to this day, and believed back then, that a person's background, like family experience background or socialization, was the cause of why they were different, right, or considered different. But as we now know that research shows that there's actually no big difference in terms of how a person was raised. Between, again, a heterosexual person and a homosexual person. So again, there must be something else that is contributing to a person's sexual orientation, right? So research has actually shown that there is a biological and genetic component to sexual orientation. So research in the last 25 years shows that there have been gene level contributions that account for at least half of the variability in sexual orientation. In a sex and gender class, you will learn that there's a specific chemicals that are released, right? And specific genes like the SRY gene that are responsible for a person becoming either a female or a male, again, during the process of being before being born, right? So again, the SRY gene is responsible for turning off a lot of hormones and turning on a lot of hormones, right? So there's a lot of genetics that are involved in terms of sexual orientation, and at least that's what research has found, okay? Um, okay, so other differences between heterosexuals and homosexuals found have included brain structure and function, and even differences in body structure and function. So again, overall, data significantly suggests that sexual orientation is something that we are born with. It's not something that we are socialized to be. Okay, there's a lot of scientific research. Again, psychology really focuses on science now because, again, we want to uncover truths, right? So the truth of why something occurs about human behavior. And what data has significantly found is that, again, sexual orientation is biologically based, okay? It's not socially or environmentally per se. All right, gender identity. Gender identity is an individual's sense of being male or female, okay? So typically gender identity again corresponds with, our chromosomal or phenotypic sex, so whether, and humans have, an XX chromosome, which makes them female, or XY chromosome, which makes them male, right? And often, when children are born as XX or XY, people will label an XX as being a woman instead of a female, right? And a male will be labeled as a man, right? But they are not the same thing because, again, man or woman is the label that we give a person based on their chromosomes, but a person may not necessarily always agree with that label. Yes, they may be biologically female or biologically men, um, uh, biologically female or biologically male, but a man or a woman may not always necessarily identify with with their gender identity of a man or a woman, because again, a person's sex, whether they were born male or female, has to do with their biology. But whether a man or a woman identifies as a man or a woman, that has to do with gender identity. And their gender identity is more of a psychological component, okay? So sometimes when individuals are not comfortable with their gender associated with their biological sex, they experience what we call gender dysphoria, okay? Gender dysphoria is a category of disorders in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for disorders, again, for individuals, who have a psychological disorder. And so gender dysphoria, again, um, is sort of that diagnosis for somebody who does not identify with as other people assume them to be. And so they will often face persistent dysphoria, okay? Um, but again, a person can only be diagnosed with this disorder, with gender dysphoria, if, they are not comfortable with their identity. If a person is completely comfortable with their identity, whether it's not the same as their sex, so let's say a male, all right, let's say a male identifies as a woman, if they are not comfortable with that, with those discrepancies in their identities, um, then they might get gender dysphoria. But if a person who is male and identifies as a woman is completely okay with it, then they won't be diagnosed, okay? So there's no distress there, okay? The distress is sort of what, the distress, the anxiety, the depression is what makes a person get diagnosed, okay? So again, gender dysphoria is something that we look at in psychological disorders when it comes to gender identity, okay? But again, sexual orientation and gender identity are often influenced by sociocultural factors. In the US, heterosexuality is the norm, okay? So I do want to emphasize that, a lot of, people expect people to be heterosexual. But in other countries, homosexuality is actually encouraged, okay? So for example, in parts of New Guinea, young boys are expected to engage in sexual behaviors with other boys for a period of time, it's just a normal cultural thing over there. And over here, our society sort of sees that as deviant, right? But in other societies, it is not, okay? You know, Um, in other you know, over here in the US, you know, for example, people are labeled a man or a woman, right? But in other cultures, so we only have two genders, right? In other cultures, for example, in Thailand, there are different genders, not just two. There's male, female, and there's a katoi, which you know has to do with intersex or trans, what we would sort of identify as trans here, but they don't see it as trans. They just see it as a different gender identity. And there's a lot of cultures that have multiple gender identities because, again, gender identity, man or woman, is a social construct. There are labels that are created by society. Male or female are biological labels that we, again, label children at birth, you know, based on their chromosomes, okay? So XX or XY, but the label of being a man or a woman, again, is a social label, right? So other societies that are very much different than us have other labels in addition, okay? So again, these are just some of the motivations for why people engage in sexual behaviors, again, whether it's physiological or socially, right? But also, we needed to clarify the difference between a person's sexual orientation and also their gender identity, okay? So we will continue this lecture in another video.